I'm Chad Reed.
I'm Hilary Langer.
I'm Gil Jenkins.
And this is Climate Positive.
What happens on our private property, whether it's our yards or a farm, impacts everybody else. I always talk about our yards not being like Las Vegas. You know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in our yard does not stay in our yard.
While the public and private sectors race to limit global temperature increases, a growing number of individuals are taking action in their own neighborhoods to support ecosystems that are already stressed by climate change. Today, we're thrilled to host Dr. Doug Tallamy, the renowned author and professor of entomology, whose work has been pivotal in highlighting the essential role of native plants for climate resiliency. By sharing his research through his nonprofit and outreach on platforms like Climate Positive, Dr. Tallamy has empowered people to make a tangible difference simply by changing how they view their own backyards. Dr. Tallamy, we're so excited to have you on today. You are a professor at the University of Delaware and author of multiple New York Times bestselling books, including most recently Nature's Best Hope and The Nature of Oaks, which are both focused on native plants and the power of native plantings. But your academic training is in entomology. What initially interested you in insects?
I took a course in college. I was a biology major. I was born loving nature. But as a child, I liked turtles and snakes and the things that little boys like. I didn't know anything about insects. So it's really, ignorance is a real barrier. People don't connect until they learn something about it. But junior year in college, we had a professor named Dr. Bugby who taught entomology. He was an entomologist. I took it from him. We really connected, and they're fascinating creatures. So I didn't know what I was going to do after college. I actually went to dental school for a while, but I didn't want to be a dentist. So I decided to try graduate school in entomology, and it worked. And here I am.
Then following getting your degree in entomology, you're now best known probably as an advocate for native plants. In an op-ed piece in the New York Times, you wrote, "Plants are as close to biological miracles as a scientist could dare admit." And I love that quote. Can you talk about the change in your focus from not just insects, but then more broadly to plants?
Well, it was actually insects that drove that change. I moved from studying insect behavior, and I studied insect parental care and how insects chose their mates and other things that are interesting, except nobody cares in them. In the year 2000, my wife and I moved into a new property. It was part of a farm that had been broken up into different lots, and we got one of those lots. It was thoroughly invaded with non-native plants, and that experience of trying to restore that piece of land is what pushed me in this direction. The first thing I noticed is that these plants from Asia, the invasive species, weren't being eaten by our native insects. I'm always looking for insects. If you don't find any, if you don't see any insect damage, there's nothing there. Now, this was not a surprise to me because we learned all about host plant specialization in graduate school. And how could an insect from North America specialize on a plant from Asia? It's not going to happen. But I thought it was common knowledge. Turned out it wasn't. Nobody was thinking about that. And that got me into the literature of seeing how serious the invasive plant problem was. It's pretty much everywhere. If they're not passing on their energy that they capture from the sun, that's a dead end for the local food web. So if you don't have plants to eat, you don't have any animals. If you don't have animals, you don't have functional ecosystems. That moves you towards ecosystem collapse. And the reason, of course, we all need ecosystems is because they're producing the life support we depend on. We call them ecosystem services, but we need more ecosystem services today than ever before because we got 8.1 billion people using those services today. So all of this was coming together at the same time. And I realized that the people who control the land where these plants are, whether they're invasive or not, we decorate our landscapes with plants from other continents. Same problem, they're not passing on their energy. So it's the landowner who is the future of conservation because the landowner is determining what plants are on his or her property. 78% of the whole country is privately owned, and 85% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So if we don't do effective conservation on private property, we're going to fail, and failure is not an option because we depend on nature. At the same time, there was a lot of headlines coming out. We've lost 3 billion breeding birds. We've got global insect decline, and the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species. Elizabeth Colbert writes the Sixth Extinction book. I mean, lots of terrible things in the news. My cause was to reach those landowners, was to convince people that they have to think about ecosystem function on their properties. It starts with plants. It starts with plant choice. And it's not something that's optional. It's something it's everybody's responsibility because everybody requires those functioning ecosystems. All of this is brand new knowledge to the average homeowner. And that has been what has motivated me to write books and give talks and talk to you. And there's a lot of people out there that need to hear this message. So
how do you bring people into this message? Insects are not as naturally charismatic as a panda, say, or even a chickadee. How do you attract new devotees who might not spend much time thinking about this?
I use pretty pictures. But you mentioned the chickadee. That's one of the main hooks. People, you're right, they don't inherently like insects, but they do inherently like birds. And if I don't talk about caterpillars, I talk about bird food. Those caterpillars are bird food. What's making the caterpillars? It's the plants that make the caterpillars, but only some plants make caterpillars. So we tie it all together, but birds are a major hook. I really do show pretty pictures. There's a lot of fascinating insects out there. There's some ugly ones too. I don't show them too much, but I could make the same argument with rodents or with worms or with pretty much any part of biodiversity. But insects, they really are fascinating creatures. And when people learn a little bit about them, it piques their interest. So pretty pictures and PowerPoints and interesting stories. The fact that the bird in your yard, it might be at your feeder, but it can't reproduce unless you give it caterpillars. All of these things are new notions to people. And it actually empowers them. People want to help the birds. Oh, if I plant an oak tree, I can help the birds. Okay, I'll plant an oak tree. It's all pretty simple.
You outline this in your book, but can you share for those who are not yet converted what it is that a chickadee, for instance, needs to raise a clutch?
Chickadees eat seeds during the wintertime. 50% of their diet is seeds. But even in the wintertime, the other 50% is insects and spiders. But when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they have to switch to invertebrates. And if they are in a healthy environment, they will favor caterpillars over everything else for several reasons. Caterpillars have the highest carotenoid content. They're very nutritious. They're soft. It's easy to stuff them down the throat of your offspring without injuring them. At least in the old days, they were abundant, an easy source of food. So chickadees love caterpillars, and so does everything else. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. The piece of information that really captured my interest was how many caterpillars they need. To get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest requires between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce. That's an astounding number. And if I figure, well, gee, I don't want just one pair of chickadees in my neighborhood. I want a whole population, and I want cardinals, and I want blue jays, and I want titmice, and I want a whole bunch of birds. How many caterpillars does that take? It takes a lot of caterpillars. What's going to make those caterpillars? If I plant a crepe myrtle, I get 0 caterpillars. If I plant a ginkgo, I get 0 caterpillars. I've got to plant the plants that generate those caterpillars. That led us to actually looking at the literature around host plant records and ranking the plant genera in terms of which ones are the best as you move around the country. And it turns out that oaks are the best. And 84% of the counties in which they occur, they're making more caterpillars than anything else. So 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillars that drive the food web. So we call those 14% the keystone plants in a typical food web. You can't have a functional food web without some keystone plants in that landscape. So I talk about them as if they are the 2x4s that hold up the ecological house you're building. In the past, we've designed landscapes trying to build our ecological house out of wallpaper, just decorations. It doesn't work. It falls down. So you get those keystone plants in your landscape, in your yard, and then you can start to decorate. But then you can have the breeding chickadee, you can have the titmice, you can have other things. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So Dan Jansen, very famous ecologist, calls them the bread and butter of terrestrial food webs, or the meat and potatoes. He's used several different descriptions. The bottom line is we try to keep it simple. If you take caterpillars out of the food web, there's very little else to eat. Most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat invertebrates that eat plants. And those invertebrates, for the most part, are caterpillars.
You and your colleagues have done a lot of work cataloging these keystone species. And it reminds me of an E.O. Wilson quote where he famously said, "We're drowning in information while starving for wisdom. The world henceforth will be run by synthesizers, people who are able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and make important choices wisely." And can you share a bit about how you have worked with your team to catalog information, make that accessible so that people can act on it?
Oh, that's great. That's a great quote. Yeah. Sure, we got a ton of information, but if you don't put it together in a meaningful way, what good is it going to do you? What has driven me really has been the public's interest. When we started working on this, people started inviting me for talks. Right away, they were intrigued by the notion that they actually could do something to help biodiversity loss. So I started giving talks, and we had very little data then. This actually was 20 years ago. But they would ask questions. The public would ask questions. And it taught me what they understood, what their ecological knowledge was coming into it. And I'm sorry to say that the ecological IQ of the US public is really low. It's not their fault. It's just that we never taught it in school. Only tree huggers need to know that, which is ridiculous since everybody requires a healthy environment and everybody is impacting that environment. So that's what guided me. I designed my talks to answer the questions that people were asking me. I've got a book coming out in March, which addresses 490 questions people have asked me on email after they have read the books I've already read and after they have heard my talks. They still have really good questions. So any synthesis that I've done has come from looking at where we have gaps in our knowledge.
And one of your research assistants, I believe, looked across the United States and the different ecoregions and native plants in those areas and cataloged that and made that accessible in a platform that's now used by other organizations like the Audubon and National Wildlife Federation. How did that project come about and what does it entail?
Yeah, that's called the Native Plant Finder, and you can find all that information on the National Wildlife Federation website. It came about because early on, we were making the statement that non-native plants don't support food webs very well, but nobody had demonstrated that. So our early experiments were to catalog what plants insects were actually eating, to do common garden experiments, which ones actually supported insects, which ones did not. And one of the early things I asked Kimberly Shrupshire, as my research assistant, I said, look at all the plant genera in the mid-Atlantic states and get host records. So she go back 100 years in the literature and look at, I found a polyphemus moth on this plant. That's a host record. She did that, 4,000 references, and was able to look at the host records on native plants and the host records on non-native plants, and we could make simple comparisons. Originally I asked her to do it just for ornamental plants, the plants that were used ornamentally. That was so successful, I said, I want you to do it for all the plant genera. And then I said, I want you to do it for all the plant genera in the entire country. And believe it or not, she is now doing it for all the plant genera in the entire world. It's important information because to fight climate change, there are a lot of groups like the Trillion Tree Initiative that want to help climate change by planting trees. They initially were planting eucalyptus everywhere. Okay, eucalyptus is going to grow, it's going to sequester carbon, but we've got a biodiversity crisis too. Why not plant the trees that will support biodiversity and sequester carbon at the same time? Well, the reason they don't is they don't know which are the best trees wherever they are. So that's why we literally are doing it for every country in the world. And she's almost done at this point now. You're in Germany. I can say here are the trees that are supporting the food web the very best. And now you have a ranking. And I got an email from her yesterday, I guess. She said they're just about finished with South America. Right? So this is going to be valuable information that can be used by climate mitigation tree planters everywhere.
Why do you think it is still so hard to find natives in nurseries? Even nurseries that tout their commitment to pollinator gardens and everything else. You'll go and they're tucked in the way back as an afterthought, and then they have all of the Asian ornamentals up front. Why do you think that they haven't caught up with public interest in this?
Public interest has changed faster than they have. That's what it boils down to. The demand for native plants now far exceeds the supply. It's a hard sell to convince the nurseryman that if he carries a lot of natives, he actually has a market for them. Now, this is changing. This is a business opportunity. When the demand exceeds the supply, then the person who supplies them is going to make some money. And there are more and more specialty nurseries focusing on natives. But I can say that the public's interest in natives has exploded in the last, maybe 5-6 years. Although the industry over the last 100 years has filtered for the plants that are easiest to grow, prettiest and easiest to grow. And that just hasn't happened yet with the native plants. And it is starting to happen.
Climate Positive is produced by HASI, a leading climate investment firm that actively partners with clients to deploy real assets that facilitate the energy transition. To learn more, visit hasi.com.
Traditionally, conservation efforts have been focused on excluding people from spaces. So put up fences and make sure that these ecologically significant areas are protected. And you're letting the people be a part of this conversation and actually empowering them to take simple actions or big actions and see the impact themselves. How has that been received by individuals?
It's been received very well. People love being empowered. They're worried about the planet. They're worried when they hear these terrible statistics and, they really get desperate, but they all feel, what can one person do? My message is there's a whole bunch of things you can do and you can see the results and you can do it right at home and it's not hard. Those are all positive messages that get people excited. We've got our parks and we've got our preserves, but we're in the 6th great extinction event. So they're obviously not good enough, which means we have to practice conservation outside the parks and preserves. That's on private property. That means that the homeowner is now in the future of conservation. A lot of people are really embracing that. They're excited about that.
And tell us about your Homegrown National Park nonprofit that you've started.
Well, that's what it is, homegrownnationalpark.org. You can go to the website, a lot of information there. We have one simple mission. We talk about the choir. That's the people who already know we've got a problem. They're already into this. We want to reach the non-choir. We want to reach the millions and millions and millions of people who don't have a clue that they're the future of conservation, because it is a grassroots movement that for success, it really requires as many people as possible. I'm going to say everybody, but we'll just say as many people as possible at this point. We've got to conserve the bulk of the land that's out there. And by conserve, I mean recreate ecosystem function on our properties. That requires an army of conservationists, and those armies are the property owner. So Homegrown National Park is designed to get that information to that homeowner. When somebody's not interested, and they're not interested largely because they don't have the knowledge to be interested, or they're in a demographic like the young parents, they're raising their kids, they're starting their careers, they're being soccer people. It is hard to say, oh, and you also have to save the world. So we want to make it as easy as possible. And I guess what I'm saying is we're trying to change the culture so that good earth stewardship is not a big deal. It's something we do every day, everywhere, everybody. And that is a big culture change, because in the past, it's only been a few ecologists and conservationists doing that. So that's what Homegrown National Park is designed to do. What you do is you go to the website and you register your property. on what we call the biodiversity map. You register your location and the amount of area on your property you're going to be a good steward of. It's kind of like a pledge. So, we have 44 million acres of lawn out there. That's an area the size of New England. I say, let's cut that area in half. Can you reduce the area of lawn in your property? The answer is yes, you can, but will you? And, if you pledge, okay, I suggest you start by cutting it in half. And that's not something you do overnight. It's something you work at over time. So they say, okay, I'm going to be a good steward on this part of my property. Then that information goes into the database, and your little piece of your county lights up with a firefly. And the object, of course, is to get the entire country to light up with a firefly. The states are color coded depending on the number of people that are participating. So there's a competition involved there. I'll give a talk and people say, wait a minute, my state is yellow. Why is that? I said, because not very many people have signed up. Oh, well, we better get to work. And so that's the idea. It's free. We are not trying to pull people away from other conservation organizations. So if you're a member of Audubon or a member of National Wildlife Federation, you stay a member of Audubon, but you're already doing good conservation on your property. We just want to record it on this biodiversity map. Well, the UN has this 30 by 30 initiative. We're going to save 30% of the planet by 2030. Biden signed on to it. We're going to save 30% of the US by 2030. That's not going to happen if we don't include conservation on private property. Nobody's doing that. Nobody's recording that. So that's what this biodiversity map is all about.
And with this, I often hear from people that they have a small site, they have a balcony, they have a quarter acre. What they do doesn't matter at all. Can you share any stories about people who have taken their quarter acre and what they have seen unfold?
An example I use in one of my talks of a woman in Chicago who has a tenth of an acre. She is a native plant landscaper, but it's not big, but it's beautiful. And she's recorded 127 species of birds that have used that property. Her property abuts O'Hare Airport. She's in the middle of Chicago. Pam Carlson is her name. I've got pictures of apartment complex. In a typical apartment complex, everybody has a balcony and they're all bare. It's a pile of bricks. It's not a resource for any living thing. But if everybody did native plant container gardening on those balconies, and then I fill it in with drawings, it all of a sudden becomes a great resource for any of the pollinators, wherever that apartment complex is, if we put the plants that they need into those cityscapes. And balconies is a great way to do it. We have part of the Homegrown National Park website dedicated to container gardening. Which native plants do well in containers in the ecoregion in which you live? So wondering what to plant, not an issue anymore. You can just go there, and maybe getting the plant is an issue, but start that container gardening and you will help bees right away. And the migrating monarch, all of those guys.
That's great. If you were able to enact an executive order or change a policy, what do you think would be most impactful for insects and biodiversity?
I thought you were going to ask me what's the most important thing somebody could do, and I would have said vote.
Hopefully our listeners are voting already.
Well, politicians make policy, and policy goes a long way. So, for example, recently, last year, the state of Delaware banned the sale of invasive plants in nurseries. And it's ridiculous to be fighting plant invasions everywhere and selling them in our nursery. That doesn't make any sense. So I'm not a big fan of top-down regulation, but sometimes it actually levels the playing field. I was surprised to hear that nurserymen want bans like that, because if you leave it up to individual nurserymen, the guy who doesn't do it wins. The cheaper wins because the public doesn't know. And if they want to buy a burning bush, even though it's highly invasive, they'll go to the guy who's still selling it. Whereas the guy who's has a conscience and is doing the right thing is going to lose that sale. If it's banned everywhere, then nobody can sell it, and that's the way to go. So that's one thing that they can do. But climate change is a big problem. It's such a big problem that it's going to take big solutions, which require big money. There is a extremely well-funded fossil fuel industry, which is fighting it tooth and nail all the way. One thing we do, we still subsidize that fossil fuel industry with trillions of dollars. Maybe we could reduce that a little bit and put more of that into the transition to clean energy. So the huge impacts can be made at the governmental level for climate change. But recognizing that we have a biodiversity crisis at the same time is really important. In farmland, and we got a lot of farmland. I heard the other day it was something like 90 million acres of corn alone in this country. But our corn and our soybeans and our wheat, the roadsides used to have weeds, things like milkweed and goldenrod and New York ironweed. And that is what kept the monarch alive. That is what kept our native bees alive, even though it's right throughout the heartland of agriculture in the US. For some reason, it became higher status as a farmer to get rid of those plants and put in lawn. So now most of those roadsides are lawn. They all have to be mowed. That's adding carbon into the atmosphere. And that has been the major cause of monarch declines in the last, well, it's almost 20 years now. So some kind of governmental mandate said, no, you got to put those plants back. It's good for the watershed, it's good for carbon sequestration, it's good for biodiversity. And, having your pretty grass there is bad for everything. So simple mandates like that would be really appropriate. There's something called pollinator strips or prairie strips that go right through the corn and the soybeans, supply habitat for the pollinators, but they also intercept topsoil before it leaves the farmland. They intercept nutrients before they get into the watershed. It's a fantastic addition to all farmland, and it's supported by CRP funding. So it's a win-win for everybody. It's another appropriate thing to mandate, where if you're going to have a farm of a certain area, you got to have these prairie strips. That's got to become part of the culture where everybody does it. We don't even think about it. Because what happens on our private property, whether it's our yards or a farm, impacts everybody else. I always talk about our yards not being like Las Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in our yard does not stay in our yard. So if you have 5 acres of lawn, you've ruined the pollinator population for the local ecosystem. You're destroying the watershed. You're not sequestering any carbon, and you're not supporting the food web. Do you have the right to do that? No. I mean, yeah, well, we can do whatever we want on our property. You can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't impact somebody else. And all of those things do impact everything else because everybody's property is part of the ecosystem.
As you describe in your books, you and your wife have spent a lot of energy rehabbing your property. What are some of the other actions that you've taken to support insects?
Well, one of the easiest things that any homeowner can do is to fight one of the major causes of insect decline, and that is light pollution at night. It turns out, well, we all know that insects go to lights at night, particularly moths. And remember, moths are the ones that are creating the caterpillars that run that food web. And then they sit there, or they get eaten by a bat, or they get eaten by a bird or a spider or something, or they bang themselves to death on the light. So light pollution is a major cause of insect decline. Of course, the easiest thing to do is turn out your lights. People don't want to do that. But switching the white bulb out of your outdoor lights and putting in a yellow bulb, which they now sell at the hardware store, they call them bug lights. That works because yellow wavelengths don't attract nocturnal insects. So it is a serious environmental problem that has an easy solution. It's one, talk about another mandate we should look at. Everybody should have yellow lights. People are actually sending an email saying, no, red lights would be even better, because insects can't see red lights at all. And it's true, it would be, but then we'd all be in a red light district. So I'm not pushing that, but yellow lights, Cindy and I, we don't have lights on at all. We don't use lights. So we haven't changed any bulbs because we don't use them. But changing out that light is one of the easiest things, the most impactful thing that somebody can do. I want to focus on the personal responsibility part of all of this, because it's just so simple. Everybody, the little old lady in the apartment who has no land at all and is never out walking in nature, she requires ecosystem services just as much as the person with 10 acres. So everybody requires happy nature on planet Earth. So it's everybody's responsibility to keeping it happy. For some reason, that's a new concept. In the past, we've had the conservation biologists and everybody else has a green light to wreck the planet. That makes no sense at all. So I want people to embrace their responsibility. If you don't have the time to modify your yard, hire somebody, and you don't have to do it overnight, but you do have to do it.
We'll switch to the hot seat with quick questions. Putting you on the spot, my favorite insect is?
My favorite insect is the moth or caterpillar I haven't seen yet. So, they're on my bucket list, and you can check them off, then they're not favorite anymore. That's always an unfair question because it's like asking you, which is your favorite child? They're all different. We love them all, but it's hard to pick a favorite.
I want my grandkids to know.
What I want my grandkids to know? I want my grandkids to know that they're living on a living planet, and if it's a dead planet, they don't have a future. They've got to keep it living. Right now, my grandkids, everybody's grandkids, their world is electronic. Their world is video games and everything that has nothing to do with real life. I want to get them connected to nature, and my grandkids are doing pretty well with that, but I want to get all the kids connected to nature, loving nature, and helping to preserve it. They don't have to give up the video games, but they do have to include nature into their life because they're a product of nature and they depend entirely on it.
When I need to relax, I
walk around with my camera outside. I guess it's my hunting instinct. I'm not walking around with a rifle. I'm walking around with a camera, and I want to get the shot of something I haven't seen before. And you get to hunt. You get to stalk and do all the things that we used to do. It's amazing how much joy, if you actually get that shot, it brings you. I know it's weird, but that's what it is.
And then finally, to me, climate positive means?
Climate positive means I'm doing something to help mitigate the pumping of fossil fuels into the atmosphere. I mean, you can stop driving your SUV and you can put up solar panels, and those are great things. The problem is you can't see the results. The easiest thing to do that does produce visual results is to plant that tree. Watch it grow. Understand that it is built out of carbon you have pulled from the atmosphere. It is pumping carbon into the soil throughout the growing season for long-term storage. It's also supporting the life around you. And all you did was put a seed in the ground. That's what climate positive means to me.
That's great. I appreciate you sharing that because we don't hear about that very often, and that is a simple switch. Thank you so much, Dr. Tallamy. It's really nice to have you on. Climate Positive is produced by Hannon Armstrong. If you enjoyed this week's podcast, please leave us a rating and review on Apple and Spotify. This helps us reach more listeners. You can also let us know what you thought via Twitter at ClimatePosiPod or email us at climatepositive@hannonarmstrong.com. I'm Hilary Langer, and this is Climate Positive.